What's DNA?
What's RNA?
What's mRNA?
How do vaccines work?
What's so different about the COVID vaccines?
Hey, I'm Eimear, and if you've asked yourself any of those questions lately, join us in this episode of Little Bits of Science, where my co-host Stephen and I will be answering those questions.
Little bits of science.
Little bits of science.
In early 2020, the world changed. Everything stopped, and we were going through something that most of us had never experienced, and that was a pandemic caused by the coronavirus, COVID-19. With the likes of DNA, RNA, and vaccines being discussed more than ever, we thought it was important to explain the basics of what they are and how they work. So in this episode of Little Bits of Science, we're going to be talking about mRNA COVID vaccines and how these new mRNA vaccines are different from normal or more traditional vaccines. And to understand how they work, we will give a basic explanation of what is DNA and RNA. So, Stephen, what is DNA?
Well, it stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and basically it contains all of the genetic information that makes you you, like the colour of your eyes or the colour of your hair. It's what's known as hereditary material, and it's made up of sections of DNA called genes, where each gene codes for a specific thing, like a set of instructions to make things such as your eye colour or your hair colour. Think of it like instructions for a Lego set, and instead of Lego blocks, the cells in your body use proteins to build each part of your body, like skin cells, hair cells, and so on. DNA is found in the nucleus. It's a sort of porous pouch in the cell that stores the DNA. Essentially, the nucleus is the command center or the brain of each cell because it controls what the cell does, and what each cell does depends on which specific section of DNA is being used by that cell. So for example, a hair cell would use a different section of DNA for instructions than a skin cell would. So that's DNA. Now onto RNA, which is a bit different. RNA, which stands for ribonucleic acid, is also a type of hereditary material, and one specific type of RNA is mRNA, or messenger RNA. So here's the thing. DNA is too large to fit through the pores of the nucleus, so it can't actually leave the nucleus to get to the part of the cell that it needs to go to use the genetic information. So for example, to make the green protein in your eye cells that cause your eyes to be green. And the actual processes in the cell, like the cell doing its normal functions, a muscle cell contracting, a cell growing, that kind of thing, they all take place inside the cell but outside of the nucleus. So in order for the genetic information in the DNA to get outside of the nucleus to where it can actually be used to do the things in the cell, the information needs to get out somehow, and that's where this messenger RNA or mRNA comes in. So mRNA is smaller than DNA and can fit through the pores of the nucleus, and it can copy the genetic information from the DNA in the nucleus. The mRNA that has the copy of that genetic information can then leave the nucleus and go to the parts of the cell that can basically read that information and make the right protein for that cell. Now, I know that's quite a lot of information, so before we go on to talk about vaccines, let's take a quick break with this episode's interesting fact and common misconception.
The word vaccine comes from the Latin word for cow, vacca. That's because the first version of a vaccine was derived by infecting people with a relatively harmless disease, cowpox, to make them immune to the deadly disease, smallpox. We've come a long way since then. Common misconception. Epidemic versus pandemic. An epidemic is when a disease breaks out and infects lots of people at the same time. If an epidemic continues to grow, spreads over a large geographic area, and infects an unusually high percentage of the population, it is then classed as a pandemic.
Everyone has heard of vaccines. And if you're listening to this, odds are you've been vaccinated at some point in your life. Like all technology, vaccine technology is always evolving, and new types of vaccines have been researched for decades. One of these new vaccines is the COVID-19 mRNA vaccine. But before we get into that, let's travel back in time to see how traditional vaccines work.
Traditional vaccines work by injecting a person with a small living or dead piece of a microbe like a bacteria or virus. The body's immune system has white blood cells that can recognize specific kinds of markers on the outside of invading microbes. The white blood cells can then find, identify that particular microbe and destroy it. Once white blood cells have this interaction with the microbe, they remember it. So the next time that type of microbe enters the person's body, for example, when somebody nearby sneezes and you inadvertently breathe in some of the microbes from their sneeze, the white blood cells of your immune system remember that microbe from the vaccine interaction and are now much better prepared to attack the microbe because of the vaccine.
So that's how traditional vaccines work. But Stephen, how do these new mRNA COVID-19 vaccines work?
So just to be clear, we say new vaccines, but scientists have been researching mRNA vaccines for decades. COVID is just the first time we're using these new vaccines. So with mRNA vaccines, you're not being injected with a microbe at all. It's just a little piece of mRNA that scientists have made in a lab, and it has the genetic instructions on it for how to make the little marker that would be found on the microbe. Once that piece of mRNA with the marker making instructions is injected into your body, your cells turn the mRNA into proteins that make up that marker. Because that cell that just made the marker doesn't know that that particular marker is from a microbe, it just displays the marker on the outside of the cell like it would normally do with its own markers, because each cell type has a different type of marker that is specific to that cell type. That's how your own body knows the difference between its own hair cells and skin cells, for example. So then the white blood cells come along, they recognize the marker as foreign, and this causes your immune system to produce lots of white blood cells, which then go and attack and destroy that foreign cell. And once that cell's destroyed, the immune system keeps a few of those white blood cells around, and that's what makes your immune system more prepared the next time you encounter that particular microbe, because it has a few of those defensive white blood cells ready to go. So the COVID-19 vaccine specifically has the mRNA instructions for making something called a spike protein, which is essentially this marker on the outside of the cell. And when you take the COVID-19 mRNA vaccine, your body produces this spike protein, your immune system destroys it and learns to recognize it in case you do come across the actual COVID-19 virus in the rest of the world. And if your immune system does recognize it quickly, then you have a much better chance of fighting off COVID, and you have a much better chance of surviving it in general.
So basically, the difference between traditional vaccines and mRNA vaccines is that with the traditional vaccines, you're being injected with the actual bacteria or virus, or a part of the bacteria or virus. Whereas with the mRNA vaccine, you're being injected with a modified piece of mRNA that your cells can translate into a marker, which essentially trains your immune system to recognize that marker.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Thanks, Stephen, for explaining DNA, RNA, and vaccines. And thanks for listening to this episode of Little Bits of Science. I hope you've learned something, and join us next week where we'll be discussing viruses.
You've been listening to Little Bits of Science, the podcast that makes science simple.
This podcast was made in association with Dundalk Institute of Technology's School of Informatics and Creative Arts and School of Health and Science and the Research Office, funded by the Summer Undergraduate Research Program. This podcast is a STEAM-based project, putting the arts in STEM.